Imagine this. You're watching a woman deliver a flawless presentation. Her voice never wavers. Her posture radiates confidence. Every answer she gives is precise, articulate, devastating in its competence. The room leans forward. People nod. Someone whispers, "She's incredible." And she is. But here's what you don't see the moment before she walked into that room, standing alone in the bathroom, staring at her reflection with hands gripping the cold porcelain sink, asking herself a question she's asked 1,000 times before. What if they discover I'm not actually this person? This is the architecture of a fear so pervasive, so deeply woven into the female experience, that most women don't even recognize it as fear. They mistake it for ambition. They call it perfectionism. They rationalize it as high standards or caring too much. But beneath every iteration of this compulsion lives a single, suffocating terror. The fear of being fundamentally, irredeemably not enough. Not enough for what exactly? That's where it becomes insidious. Not enough to be loved authentically. Not enough to deserve the space she occupies. Not enough to justify her own existence without constant proof of value. It's a fear that doesn't announce itself with panic attacks or sleepless nights, though those come too. Instead, it operates like background radiation, invisible but corrosive, warping every decision, every relationship, every quiet moment of self-reflection into an interrogation. Think about the last time you watched a woman apologize, not for something she did wrong, but for simply existing in a space. Sorry, I have a question. Sorry to bother you, but why does she apologize for breathing? Because somewhere deep in her psychological architecture, she's been taught that her presence is inherently intrusive, that she must continuously earn the right to take up space, to speak, to have needs. The apology isn't politeness. It's a ritual of self-erasure performed so frequently it becomes unconscious. Now imagine the opposite scenario. A woman who never apologizes, who speaks her mind without softening her edges, who says no without guilt, who demands rather than requests. What happens to her? She's called aggressive, difficult, too much. The words change depending on the culture, but the message remains constant. There is a precise bandwidth within which a woman is permitted to exist, and stepping outside it triggers immediate correction. She must be confident but not arrogant, strong but not intimidating, ambitious but not ruthless, sexual but not promiscuous, nurturing but not weak. The contradictions aren't just confusing, they're engineered to be impossible. So she learns to read the room with the precision of a hostage negotiator. She becomes fluent in 1,000 micro-adjustments, calibrating her laugh, her posture, her opinions, her very existence to match whatever will generate the least friction. And here's the cruelest part. She becomes so skilled at this performance that she forgets she's performing at all. The mask becomes the face. The role becomes the identity. Until one day, in a moment of terrible clarity, she realizes she can no longer remember what she actually wants because she spent decades focused solely on what others want from her. This isn't about weakness. This is about a fear so sophisticated it disguises itself as strength. The woman who works herself into exhaustion isn't necessarily passionate about her career. She might be running from the terror that without achievement, she has no worth. The woman who maintains a flawless appearance isn't vain. She might be desperately trying to control the one variable in an equation that always finds her lacking. The woman who gives endlessly to everyone around her isn't necessarily generous. She might be attempting to preemptively purchase the love she's terrified she doesn't deserve. In this video, we're going to uncover the secret female fear no one talks about. A truth that touches not only women, but also the way society perceives and responds to them. This fear shapes relationships, careers, and even the way a woman defines love and self-worth. And at the end of this journey, we'll reveal something even deeper. A truth so powerful it can dissolve that fear entirely, transforming how you see yourself and every woman around you. Before we dive in, take a moment to support this channel. If you believe that understanding the mind and spirit can change lives, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and your engagement helps this message reach others who may need to hear it. And I promise you, the final revelation in this video will change how you understand the female psyche forever. What if the greatest prison ever constructed had no walls, no guards, no visible boundaries, only the internalized belief that freedom itself would make you unlovable? What if you discovered that the very things you've been calling your personality, your accommodation, your flexibility, your selflessness are actually symptoms of a fear you inherited before you were old enough to question it? The question isn't whether you've felt this fear. If you're a woman reading this, you have. The question is, what would your life look like if you didn't? What would you dare to want? What would you dare to become? And more terrifyingly, who would you be if you stopped measuring yourself against an impossible standard that was never designed for you to meet? That's where this exploration begins. Not with answers, but with the recognition that the fear itself might be the most profound conspiracy of silence in human psychology. Because the moment you name it, everything changes. This fear doesn't arrive fully formed. It's cultivated meticulously. From the first moment a little girl learns that her value is negotiable. It begins with language so innocent it seems harmless. Be a good girl. What does that mean exactly? Be quiet. Be accommodating. Be less of a disruption. The opposite, be a good boy, carries entirely different weight. Boys are good when they're brave, when they achieve, when they conquer. Girls are good when they disappear just enough to make everyone else comfortable. Carl Jung understood this mechanism when he wrote about the persona, the mask we construct to navigate social expectations. But for women, the persona isn't just a professional facade. It's an entire architecture of self-betrayal built so early that it becomes indistinguishable from identity itself. Jung called the process of reclaiming authenticity individuation. But he never fully reckoned with how much more violent that process becomes when your entire gender has been systematically taught that authenticity equals unworthiness. The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir declared that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. She recognized that femininity isn't biological destiny. It's a constructed prison of expectations, constantly reinforced through 1,000 invisible corrections. Sit differently. Speak softer. Smile more. Take up less space. Each instruction seems trivial in isolation, but together they form a comprehensive training program in self-erasure. By the time a girl reaches adulthood, she's internalized an entire surveillance system, constantly monitoring herself for any deviation from acceptable femininity. Psychologically, this manifests as what Brené Brown calls the armor of perfectionism, not the pursuit of excellence, but the desperate attempt to avoid shame. Because beneath perfectionism lies a terrifying equation. If I can just be flawless enough, perhaps I can finally be safe from judgment, rejection, abandonment. But perfection is a horizon that retreats as you approach it. The goal isn't actually achievement. It's the maintenance of perpetual striving that prevents you from ever having to confront the possibility that you might already be enough. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the will to power. But he never adequately addressed how women are taught to channel that will inward, toward self-improvement rather than world-changing. A woman's ambition becomes self-directed violence, the relentless project of becoming acceptable, becoming lovable, becoming small enough to fit inside the narrow container society has prepared for her. The energy that could topple empires gets redirected toward calorie counting, people-pleasing, and the exhausting performance of effortless perfection. This is where the fear becomes truly insidious. It doesn't feel like oppression because it's wrapped in the language of choice. I want to be beautiful. Do you? Or have you been taught that beauty is the price of visibility? I want to be nurturing. Do you? Or have you learned that your value is measured by how much you can give before you break? The genius of this system is that it convinces women they're freely choosing the very chains that bind them. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of bad faith, the act of lying to ourselves about our own freedom. Women live in a state of profound bad faith, convinced they're making autonomous choices while operating within a framework specifically designed to limit those choices to a predetermined set of acceptable options. You're free to be anything you want, as long as you're still fundamentally pleasing, non-threatening, and available for the emotional labor of those around you. The neuroscience confirms what philosophy intuited. Our brains are shaped by our environments, particularly during developmental years. When a young girl is repeatedly rewarded for accommodation and punished for assertion, her neural pathways literally rewire to prioritize others' comfort over her own truth. It's not metaphorical. The fear becomes biology. It becomes the lens through which she perceives reality itself, so deeply embedded that questioning it feels like questioning gravity. Here's what makes this fear so devastatingly effective. It doesn't just limit what women do, it limits what they can even imagine wanting. The most successful prison is the one where inmates police themselves, where the bars are invisible because they've been internalized as common sense, as natural law, as just the way things are. Watch what happens in a meeting when a woman has an idea. She'll often begin with a disclaimer, "This might be stupid, but," or "I'm not sure if this makes sense, but men rarely do this." They state ideas as declarations, even bad ones, especially bad ones. The woman's disclaimer isn't humility, it's preemptive damage control. She's already anticipating rejection and attempting to soften its impact by rejecting herself first. This is the cognitive bias known as self-handicapping. But for women, it's not occasional. It's systemic, automatic, reflexive. The psychological term for this is imposter syndrome. But that diagnosis is itself a trap. It frames the problem as individual pathology. There's something wrong with her confidence, her self-esteem, her internal processing. But imposter syndrome isn't a bug in the female psyche. It's a feature of a system that constantly tells women they don't belong in spaces of power, competence, or authority. You're not imagining the hostility. The feeling of being an imposter is a rational response to actually being treated like one. Consider the double bind of emotional labor. Women are expected to be the emotional processors for everyone around them, the ones who remember birthdays, smooth over conflicts, intuit needs before they're spoken. This labor is invisible, unpaid, and mandatory. When a woman performs it well, nobody notices. When she fails to perform it, she's called cold, selfish, uncaring. The man who occasionally remembers an anniversary is celebrated as thoughtful. The woman who forgets one is evidence of her fundamental deficiency. This creates what psychologists call role overload, the impossible task of being everything to everyone while maintaining the fiction that it requires no effort. She must be the devoted mother, the passionate partner, the ambitious professional, the supportive friend, the dutiful daughter. Each role comes with its own surveillance system, its own set of judges ready to pronounce her inadequate. And because these roles often have contradictory demands, failure is inevitable. She's neglecting her children if she's focused on her career. She's not ambitious enough if she prioritizes her children. There is no winning configuration. The exhaustion isn't just physical, it's existential. It's the bone-deep weariness of living in a state of permanent performance evaluation, where every interaction is a test you didn't know you were taking until you've already failed it. Viktor Frankl wrote about the search for meaning in suffering, but he never adequately addressed what happens when the suffering itself is meaningless, when it's not building character or serving a purpose, but simply grinding you down in service of other people's comfort. This is where the fear metastasizes into something even more insidious: self-abandonment. She stops asking, "What do I want?" because that question has become dangerous. Wanting things, having needs, expressing preferences, these acts of basic human autonomy become sources of guilt. She learns to experience her own desires as burdens she's inflicting on others. Her hunger becomes an imposition. Her anger becomes a character flaw. Her exhaustion becomes proof that she's not trying hard enough. The cruelest consequence of all? She begins to believe that this diminished version of herself is actually who she is. The mask isn't just worn, it's mistaken for the face beneath. And when someone asks her what she wants, genuinely wants, she freezes. Because she's spent so long translating her wants into what others need from her that she can no longer locate her own authentic desires beneath the calcified layers of accommodation. But here's what the architects of this fear never anticipated. Awareness itself is an act of rebellion. The moment you see the cage clearly, its bars begin to dissolve. Not because the system changes, but because you stop granting it authority over your sense of self. This is the counterintuitive truth that liberates. You don't break free by becoming stronger, more perfect, or more acceptable. You break free by withdrawing your belief in the lie that your worth was ever conditional. Think about what happens when you stop apologizing for existing. Not belligerently, not as performance, but as a quiet reclamation of your right to occupy space. The first time you state an opinion without softening it with maybe or I could be wrong, but something shifts. The sky doesn't fall. People don't abandon you. In fact, something remarkable happens. You become more magnetic, not less. Because authenticity, even uncomfortable authenticity, is infinitely more compelling than the exhausting performance of perfection. This is where we must acknowledge the women who walked this path before us, who paid the price for refusing to shrink. Virginia Woolf, who wrote about needing a room of one's own, not just physical space, but psychological sovereignty. Audre Lorde, who declared that your silence will not protect you, and chose radical honesty over safety. Simone Weil, who understood that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, including attention to one's own truth. These women weren't fearless. They were terrified. But they chose authenticity over comfort, and in doing so, they created templates for liberation that still reverberate today. The path forward requires what Alan Watts called the wisdom of insecurity, the recognition that the safety you've been promised in exchange for self-betrayal is an illusion anyway. You've been contorting yourself to avoid rejection, but the rejection you fear most has already occurred. You rejected yourself the moment you decided that who you actually are wasn't acceptable. Every other rejection is just an echo of that original wound. So here's the radical reframe. What if disappointing others is not a failure but evidence that you're finally living from your center? What if the discomfort people feel when you set boundaries is their work to do, not yours? What if difficult is just what they call a woman who has stopped making herself small for their convenience? This isn't about becoming harsh or uncaring. It's about recognizing that real compassion for yourself and others requires honesty, not endless accommodation. The practice begins with small acts of sovereignty. Notice when you're about to apologize for something that doesn't require an apology. Catch yourself mid-sentence and simply stop. Feel the discomfort of not smoothing over a moment of tension. Let someone else carry their own emotional weight for once. These acts feel impossibly difficult at first, because you're fighting against neural pathways carved over decades. But each time you choose differently, you weaken the old pattern and strengthen something new. Start asking yourself the question that terrifies you most. What do I actually want? Not what you should want. Not what would make you look good or make others happy. What do you want? Your body knows the answer, even if your mind has forgotten how to access it. It's there in the visceral yes or no that arises before you have time to rationalize it away. Learning to trust that instinct again is learning to trust yourself again. Now we arrive at the deepest truth, the one that renders everything else suddenly, devastatingly clear. All of this, the fear, the performance, the endless striving, the self-betrayal has been built on a single foundational lie. And that lie is this: that your worth is something you must earn, prove, or maintain through constant vigilance. That who you are, at your core, is somehow insufficient and requires endless improvement, validation, or transformation to become acceptable. But what if worth isn't an achievement? What if it's not a state you arrive at after sufficient self-improvement? What if worth is the ground you've been standing on all along, so close you couldn't see it, so fundamental you mistook it for nothing at all? The mystic poet Rumi understood this when he wrote, "You wander from room to room hunting for the diamond necklace that is already around your neck." This isn't poetic metaphor. This is precise spiritual psychology. You have spent your entire life searching for something you already possess, convinced that it exists somewhere outside you in achievement, in beauty, in love, in perfection. But the treasure you seek is not a destination. It is your origin. It is what you are, not what you must become. Carl Jung called this process individuation, not the creation of a better self, but the discovery of the whole self that has always existed beneath the fragmented persona. He wrote that the goal of life is not perfection but completeness, not the elimination of shadow, but the integration of it, not becoming acceptable, but becoming real. This distinction is everything, because perfection is always external, always conditional, always just out of reach. But wholeness is internal, unconditional, and eternally present. Here's the revelation that changes everything. The fear of not being enough cannot survive in the presence of this understanding. It dissolves not because you've finally achieved enough, but because you've recognized that the entire framework of enough was a trap. You are asking the wrong question. The question was never, am I enough? The question is, enough for what? For whom? And who gave them the authority to measure? Think about a tree. Does an oak tree strive to be enough? Does it apologize for the space its roots require, Or the shadow it casts? Or the way it grows crooked toward the light? No, it simply unfolds according to its nature. It doesn't earn its right to exist through productivity or beauty or usefulness. Its existence itself is its justification. You are no different. You are not here to justify your presence through achievement. You are here because consciousness wanted to experience itself through your particular lens, your specific combination of perception and possibility. This is what the great spiritual traditions have always pointed toward, though the language varies. Buddhism calls it your original nature, the awareness that exists before thought, before conditioning, before the construction of self. Christianity speaks of being made in the image of the divine, inherently worthy before any action or achievement. Hinduism describes the Atman, the eternal self that is never diminished by circumstances or failures. The language differs, but the truth is identical. What you are seeking is what is doing the seeking. But here's where this becomes more than philosophy. Here's where it becomes revolutionary. When a woman truly embodies this understanding, not as intellectual concept, but as lived reality, everything about her changes. Not because she's trying to change, but because the fundamental orientation of her life has shifted. She stops moving from fear and starts moving from presence. She stops seeking permission and starts granting it to herself. She stops asking, "Will they love me?" and starts asking, "Do I love this? Does this align with my truth?" This shift terrifies the systems built on her compliance. Because a woman who knows her inherent worth cannot be controlled through shame. She cannot be manipulated through guilt. She cannot be diminished through criticism or rejection because she no longer outsources her sense of self to others' opinions. This doesn't make her invulnerable to pain. She still feels deeply, perhaps more deeply than before. But the pain moves through her rather than defining her. She can be hurt without being destroyed, challenged without being demolished, rejected without being diminished. And here's the final, most profound implication. When you stop performing worthiness and start embodying it, you give every other woman permission to do the same. The fear is transmitted generationally, passed from mother to daughter through 1,000 subtle corrections and worried warnings. But so is liberation. When you break the cycle in yourself, you break it for everyone connected to you. Your daughter, if you have one, watches you set boundaries and learns that her no is sacred. Your mother, if she's willing, might finally give herself permission to shed the mask she's worn for decades. Your friendships deepen because they're no longer based on mutual performance, but on mutual recognition. This is not a solitary journey. This is a collective awakening disguised as individual healing. Every woman who remembers her inherent worth creates a crack in the architecture of the fear. And through those cracks, light pours in. Not the light of perfection, but the light of truth. The recognition that you were never broken, never behind, never insufficient. You were simply asleep to what you've always been. So here's what I'm asking you to consider, not as belief, but as experiment. What if, just for today, you acted as though your worth was never in question? What if you moved through the world as though you had nothing to prove, no performance to maintain, no value to demonstrate? Not arrogantly, but quietly, from a place of deep inner knowing. What would you do differently? What would you finally allow yourself to want? What would you stop tolerating? Who would you become when you're no longer afraid? The secret female fear, no one talks about the fear of not being enough, dissolves in the presence of this single revolutionary truth. You are not your achievements, your appearance, your roles, or your reputation. You are the awareness witnessing all of it. You are the consciousness that existed before you learned to doubt yourself, and you will remain when all the external markers fade. That consciousness is not something you earn. It is what you are. It has always been enough because enough was never the right measure for infinity. Welcome home. You were never lost. You were just looking in the wrong direction.